While we often focus on the battles of World War II, and the History Channel certainly reinforces that, it's crucial to understand its transformative impact on American life. Like the Civil War, World War II marks a watershed moment, a turning point after which everything shifted. Before the war, simmering social tensions like racial inequality existed largely under the surface, acknowledged but tolerated. But the war effort's call for universal participation changed the dynamic. As we saw in films like Los Mineros, those who contributed to the war wouldn't silently accept the status quo afterward. This paved the way for the civil rights movement to gain momentum. Black Americans, while serving valiantly in the military and essential war industries, still faced widespread discrimination. A. Philip Randolph, leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, organized a planned march on Washington to protest this injustice. However, recognizing the optics of fighting a war framed as anti-racist, while perpetuating systemic racism at home, President Roosevelt took action. He signed Executive Order 8802, prohibiting racial discrimination in defense industries. While this didn't immediately end all racist practices, it was a groundbreaking legal step toward progress. Without World War II, this turning point in the fight for civil rights wouldn't have occurred. The same transformative dynamic applies to the women's rights movement. We saw women step into factory roles during World War I, and again in World War II. After World War I, there was a societal expectation for women to return to domestic life, a shift reflected in films like The 20s. However, after World War II, many women experienced a profound shift in perspective. Having tasted the freedom and capability that wartime work provided, they were unwilling to simply return to their pre-war roles and the limitations of second-class citizenship. This fueled the nascent women's rights movement, sparking a demand for equality and opportunity. The war effort dramatically shifted immigration dynamics. With American men fighting overseas or switching to wartime industries, a significant labor shortage arose in the agricultural sector. Think back to those grapes of wrath scenarios. To address this need, the U.S. government initiated the Bracero Program, an agreement allowing temporary laborers, primarily from Mexico, to work on American farms. The understanding was that these workers would return home after the war. However, the American Constitution introduces a critical complication. Anyone born on U.S. soil is automatically a citizen. So while Bracero workers initially arrived legally, their children born in the U.S. became full citizens. After the war, when the government demanded that Braceros return home, a complex situation arose. Some who came legally now found themselves labeled as illegal since the U.S. no longer needed their labor. Additionally, their American-born children, as citizens, couldn't be deported. This is one of the roots of today's challenges surrounding undocumented immigration. The Bracero program, while necessary at the time, had unintended consequences still debated today. The Japanese internment camps stand as a stark reminder of the war's impact. This decision undeniably carried strains of racism, yet attributing it solely to racism may be an oversimplification. Throughout history, we've witnessed hostility towards various groups: Irish immigrants, Eastern Europeans, Jews, and Catholics, often fueled more by societal fear than purely racial prejudice. Sadly, a similar dynamic played out against the Japanese during World War II, and we continue to see echoes of it in the treatment of Hispanic communities and Muslims today. While World War II concluded and the U.S. emerged as a global superpower, this victory ironically sowed the seeds of future internal conflict. The unresolved tensions we discussed, racial inequality, economic disparity, anxieties about immigration, ultimately culminated in widespread social unrest by the late 1960s. This is the backdrop for much of what we'll be exploring in the rest of this course. The year 1968 became emblematic of national instability. Political assassinations, violent protests, an unpopular war, and widespread societal disunity. This moment of profound turmoil can be seen as an unexpected consequence of America's wartime triumph. Let's discuss a significant legacy of World War II. The United States emerged as a dominant global power, but unlike the post-World War I retreat into isolationism, there was a strong sense of responsibility to actively defend democratic principles worldwide. This newfound engagement was partly fueled by the nascent Cold War, which took center stage even before the official end of World War II. We'll discuss this in greater depth later. Essentially, the Cold War involved a profound ideological clash between the United States and the Soviet Union. This conflict centered on economics, The Soviet Union championed communism and sought its expansion, while the United States staunchly defended capitalism. While both sides presented their systems as a form of democracy, the framing differed significantly. Americans saw this conflict through the lens of democracy versus totalitarian communism. In contrast, the Soviets viewed American capitalism as imperialism and positioned their ideology as the true path to democracy. This was an ongoing battle of rhetoric and ideology, setting the stage for decades-long geopolitical tension. The end of World War II triggered a wave of decolonization. European powers, weakened by the conflict, relinquished their overseas empires. Nations like India, various Southeast Asian countries, and African states gained independence, ending the era of direct colonial rule. However, these newly independent nations faced enormous challenges. Their economies had been systematically designed to fuel the economies of their former colonial masters. Upon independence, those economic systems often collapsed, leaving these nations economically devastated. This created fertile ground for global superpowers to compete for influence. The Cold War dynamic quickly ensnared these emerging nations. Both the Soviet Union and the United States sought to win favor and exert influence in these regions, sometimes leading to devastating conflicts. In places like Afghanistan and Vietnam, local struggles for independence became proxy wars fueled by Cold War ideology. The U.S. intervention in Vietnam provides a tragic example. Americans often viewed their involvement as a mission to defend democracy, unaware that they were inadvertently propping up a colonial regime, something we'll delve into later. This disconnect led to significant opposition from within the very population the U.S. claimed to be liberating. It's a complex issue, and one you'll be exploring in more detail in upcoming readings. Finally, and perhaps most profoundly, the world entered the nuclear age. Unlike the devastation of World War I, where the world ultimately endured, the development of nuclear weapons introduced the terrifying possibility of total annihilation, the potential end of human civilization as we know it. This wasn't a far-fetched concept. The apocalyptic scenarios popular today are rooted in this very real fear. This threat of global destruction fueled a pervasive sense of unease, aptly called the Age of Anxiety. People lived with the constant, unsettling worry that nuclear conflict could erupt at any moment. This anxiety was inseparable from the escalating Cold War, as both the United States and the Soviet Union rapidly developed massive nuclear arsenals. As you finish reading The Good War, and particularly the Street Corner Kids section, consider how this pervasive fear of nuclear war might have impacted those kids. How might it shape their outlook on life and the future? Please proceed to answer the questions in the assignment on Canvas. If you have any questions, you can post them in the open forum discussion or contact the professor using Canvas email.